And as we prepare to discuss how we educate the next generation, let's be mindful that here in Australia, we are on the land of the world's oldest continuous living culture. For 65,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been refining and passing on their knowledge of how to live sustainably to their young people. And as we'll no doubt hear today from Vanessa, First Nations wisdom remains as vital as ever if we are to transition to a more regenerative future. So I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands UTS City Campus stands. I want to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge on this unceded land. And I invite you to use the chat to acknowledge the First Nations people whose land you are on, if you know that. During the session, we've got the chat. And for those of you who like thinking aloud, feel free to use that as an informal back channel. But use the Q&A button to post questions for after Vanessa's presentation. And you can upvote them there if you want. Please just keep them succinct, no 3-paragraph questions. Thank you very much. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. It's one of my life's great pleasures to encounter thinking that really stretches and challenges me far beyond my experience and understanding. And it was Vanessa's work with her book, Hospicing Modernity, that's really been the intellectual discovery for me of the last few years. And that was followed just a few months ago by Outgrowing Modernity, part 2 of the story. I think you'll agree that the fabric of modern society is looking stretched increasingly thin. Indeed, it feels like it's coming apart at the seams in many places. Ecological, economic, social, political, and psychological crises feel like they're conspiring to form what some are referring to as, the polycrisis, which just means many crises, or even the meta crisis. We have a crisis of crises. It's Vanessa's quite unflinching analysis of our predicament and bringing together global North and South scholarship and worldviews into dialogue, which I think is what's earned her such deep respect. And that prepared my mind to be blown a second time, because then in recent years with her colleagues in the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Arts Research Collective, they reframed generative AI. That's my home turf. But critiquing the tool-centric, transactional, extractive mindset that drives the technology industry, rather trying to open up a conversation for a space for a very different conversation, for thinking of AI in a more relational, inclusive, life-affirming way, which is reflecting the wisdom of Indigenous and Black and Global South and Earth-aligned traditions. That's been mind-stretching, and to me is some of the most, advanced thinking at the moment we have around how to approach AI. Well, obviously AI is wreaking havoc in universities, so maybe it will crop up today. We'll see. But as we'll hear, according to Vanessa, universities have got to get to grips with a much more deeply ingrained problem than our baby 3-year-old Gen AI assessment crisis. Okay, that's the new kid on the block. The question is, how do we reimagine universities as they're striving to navigate the white water right now of a VUCA world? And indeed, many of us are feeling quite drenched in that white water right now. So let's be mindful that, while some of us are high on adrenaline and, we've got a high performance kayak here and we feel we're navigating these rapids very well, others among us, I know, are struggling to keep that kayak upright. We may be feeling quite vulnerable and barely ready to be told that we need to brace for bigger rapids. But we're all here, we're curious, and we want to understand the sort of shifting tectonic plates that are causing all of this turbulence. So, without further ado, I want to invite you to welcome Vanessa, who is going to share some thoughts with us, and then we'll go into Q&A. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Simon. This was a beautiful introduction. I'm speaking to you today from the lens of the Kaitahu people. I'm in Aotearoa, and just acknowledging that it would be amazing if I could be close. We're close, And would have been amazing to do this in person. My son's partner is Caetaro, so I'm here visiting Fano, and I also came for a couple of conferences. So it's a pleasure to be here with you online today. I would like to start by acknowledging the land as a living entity, not a property or resource, acknowledging ancestors yet to come and those who have come before us, and the different ways we have to honor them. We must honor them, and to the ones who come before by also correcting their mistakes, and to the ones yet to come, saying that the buck stops here, right? Trying to process as much of the intergenerational traumas, both systemic and ancestral, through that come through the family, right? And the next acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that for us to be here today, we depend on a lot of systemic structural ongoing violence. And this is not a call for guilt or shame, but for a visceral form of responsibility. And the last acknowledgement is that we are all a huge family of human and non-human beings that's currently in distress. There's a lot of change happening, and we have a responsibility to use the space for forms of healing, and that includes stepping back a little bit and approaching problems, maybe even for the first time as a species, recognizing that species itself is a construct, but maybe a useful one for the kinds of things we are facing right now. So, the title of this presentation is Repurposing the University in Times of Social and Ecological Breakdown. This title comes from a paper that I wrote with Dr. Sharenstein from UBC that was published in the Canadian Journal of Education. And because you have access to this paper, I decided to include another paper that comes from the same family of papers that is called Deepening Relational Capacity to Confront the Polycrisis in Higher Education and Beyond. So I will focus more on that paper today because it provides the soil from which this repurposing happens. In the first paper, you will see two different case studies that we included there. In the second paper, there was one that came later, which is to do with my experience as a dean of a faculty of education going through budget cuts. And this was happening at the same time of the encampments. There was an opioid crisis that year, a crisis of accommodations at the university. And so the senior leadership had to be together in a very different way to be able to respond to all this crisis together. Now, I do have an issue with the meta crisis and the polycrisis framing, because when we frame things as crisis, and I do too, I mean, I'm not putting myself outside of this, but the moment we frame things as crisis, it's like something has been broken and needs to be fixed. So, in terms of the wider systemic issues that we're facing, it may be better to call it a meta consequence or a polyculmination, because then we can look at it in a much wider time frame and understand the reflexes we have in relationship to this problem. So, in terms of the meta consequence, what we're living today as we face the limits of the planet, this is not something that happened, like it's not something good that has been broken. It is a system that has been bad for the planet that now might be just coming to an end, and we have an opportunity there for a different form of existence. So that we can face the collapse of a bad system as a reckoning and as a portal to something else. And so today we're going to be talking about the university like that too, and trying to see if we can understand the university moving from this metaphor of the ivory tower, which is super problematic because it is grounded on colonialism, slavery, and there's a lot of sexism and on other forms of structural inequality, including meritocracy, the ways that meritocracy has been imposed, and the hierarchization of intelligence. So that metaphor of the ivory tower is extremely problematic. But today I would argue that the university is at best a leaning tower of Pisa in a swamp. And it's leaning, right? It's gonna fall. But if it falls hard, as some want to see, we will lose a lot. We will throw the baby with the bathwater. And of course, there are some wanting to put it back to the ivory tower mode. But what I'm arguing is that if we have a controlled fall, a contained fall, maybe if it falls slowly, we might see the university becoming a tree and then a nurse log for other life to come through it. And in order to do that, we have to interrupt the satisfaction we have with things that are actually not very good, and to invest in forms of composting and bring in the mycelium that is going to turn that nurse log into something fertile for other species, and then it spread the nutrients on the ground, which is which is the metaphor for reality. So if the university comes to the ground and understands better its place as a nurse log in society, it can offer nutrients for many other life forms that come from the soil. So this is the summary of the presentation, and in order to get you there, we're going to be talking about soil today. So in soil, the first thing that we need to understand, I think, together is complexity, right? And when we talk about complexity, the most important thing that I found in my work in education is that we need to invite people to understand their own complexity. So that's the first invitation for you. So how do we learn to face hypercomplexity together requires a different vocabulary for us to look at ourselves. And we have been testing this methodology of the bus, the bus within us, for the last 10 years. And it kind of works. And if it becomes a practice, it really allows us to have a language to talk about the different parts of us. It's like IFS as well, but it's a little bit different. It allows us to give voice to different passengers on our bus. So imagine yourself as a bus. It could be a different metaphor, but the metaphor has to have both movement, dissonance, so movement, dissonance. There's one more thing that I now forget, but it will come back. At least movement and plurality. It has to have movement, dissonance, and plurality. The bus works because then you can imagine there is a driver and lots of passengers. And at the front, you have passengers who you know very well. In the middle, passengers that speak occasionally. And at the back, there may be passengers that are trying to hide from you or that you have repressed. And the idea, the invitation, is for you to hold space for the conversations happening on the bus, not to throw out any passenger, but just observe yourself and create a gap between what you receive when you're listening or exposed to something and how you respond, so that you don't react. You understand that there's something going on, and that the more you can observe your bus, the better your relationships are going to be. So that's very important. And in this metaphor of the bus, we ask people to observe what the passengers are saying, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, how old they are, whether they're speaking from fear or trauma, if they sound like somebody you know, generally an authoritative figure, or not. Do they want things to be black and white? Do they trust the driver? So there are lots of ways you can use this metaphor, and you can also invite people to talk about, for example, in check-ins, check your bus and tell us how, how the drive is going. And then people go, oh, my bus is going up the hill, down the hill, round a roundabout, has fallen into a ditch, but the passengers are putting it back on. So bringing in the playfulness and the ludic, it's very important also to rewire the ways we relate to each other and to speak from a different neurophysical stance. So the metaphor part of it and the storying part of it activates different parts of the brain and brings forth this more relational way of being, where we can play a little bit with each other rather than kind of focus on this performance of a single identity and a single perspective. So I'm going to put it out there in the beginning of the presentation so that when we have the conversation later, we can also bring it back. And so that as you watch the presentation, you can also be checking your bus, observing your bus. And if resistance comes up, welcome it, but not as a form of investment, as a form of observation. So think about if there's resistance, why am I resisting? And then try to trace where the resistance is coming from and to treat it as a teacher rather than as a driver of the bus. So that's my invitation. So, the most important question, I think, for our times and for us to have collective conversations about consequences and crisis is the question, when are we? And if we look at, like, you can do this exercise with different, in different ways, I guess, but when I did this exercise with my faculty members 2 years ago, we were looking at British Columbia, our province, as the first element of this conversation. So we were looking at what kinds of things we're carrying at a planetary level, including climate change, but the biodiversity collapse, in terms of the international sphere, the escalation of armed conflict, the rise of fascism, national mental health and education sector crisis. At provincial level, we had the wildfires, water and food security threats, local in Victoria, housing crisis, the rising cost of living, also affecting our students and our faculty members and our staff and our communities. In terms of families and communities, escalating emotional dysregulation and escalating conflicts. And at a personal level, of course, you have stress and you have burnout. But we also looked at what we are carrying in terms of the sector of higher education. So, and that's what you're going to find in the two articles. So at one level, uncertain finances, affordability crisis, intergenerational dissonance, the crisis of public relevance or irrelevance, how the public sees the university. There's also ambivalent AI, ambivalent because some people are going to be the super happy adopter, some people want to reject it, and then you have people in the middle who don't know what to do. Then complexities of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, also hyperpolarization. Then we have escalating mental health crisis and costs, including the crisis of accommodation, when there's a rise in accommodation requests. Then there's ecological destabilization and a lack of capacity for coordination because we were used to coordinating in a much more stable environment. And then when the environment is facing volatility, uncertainty, complexity, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambivalence or ambiguity, we don't have the tools to address that collectively together because our tools were meant for a stable environment. So what do we do then in our work to create the kind of relational fabric that will help us remain together, not turn on each other as the ground shakes? So I chose that from all these things to focus on technology because I think this discussion on technology actually was one of the most impactful for my community my university community when I was a dean. And why this and remember, like, this is one of the threads of change. So focus on technology and some of the social changes happening, and try to present the implications for the university. But remember, this is just one part of the puzzle. There's more change happening at the same time. But we start with 1993, just in terms of technology in the last 32 years. 1993 was when a commercial internet becomes available. And what I remember of that time is that I was starting university in 1993. And there was a group of professors who created a manifesto against the internet. They wanted to ban the internet in the world. And in that manifesto, their critique was actually not bad. It was pretty good. But the problem that was that there was a sense of agency that the students felt was misplaced. So I joined the strike against the professors because the students felt they were meddling with their future. And we at that time, what we were saying to the professors was that we needed elders. We didn't need people blocking and closing doors, because it was going to be something, the internet was going to be something that we felt we would have to deal with. And we were calling the professors to help us in that journey rather than try to block it. And we also felt at the time that they were blocking it on grounds related to the maintenance of their power, their power relations, right? And their sense of authority. So we felt that some of the critique was coming from that place, and that's why it was misplaced. So that happened in 1993. 1998, Google was founded. 2000 was the mass adoption of cell phones. 2003, now defunct Skype. And 2004, it was Facebook. 2005, YouTube. 2007, there is the introduction of iPhones, mass adoption of smartphones, and Netflix starts. 2010, it's Instagram. 2020, it's Zoom. Zoom existed before, but then it starts to grow because, of course, of the pandemic. There's a hybrid learning revolution, we could argue. 2021, it's TikTok that becomes the most visited website globally, surpassing Google. 2022, ChatGPT and other LLM AI are made publicly available. 2023, Twitter rebrands itself to X under Elon Musk, and it goes. So the idea here is to invite you into diachronic reasoning. It's reasoning that can see where things are coming from, where they're at, where they're going. Now, what does this mean for society? There are many, many different implications, but one of them here is that there's a change in access to information, in knowledge production, in social relations, in identity building, in the sense of belonging, in the use of time, a change in attention span, jobs, health, and well-being in this period. And for higher education, there's a loss of the monopoly over value creation and selection. So before, let's say in the 1990s, the university was at its peak in terms of the perception, the social society's perception of the university as the place where knowledge is produced. So to give you an example, in 1990, some professors had secretaries, and there was a place at the table for the university in most policy making processes, right? So the university had that status of the place where knowledge of worth is offered to society. But then there's an exponential increase in publishing. The traditional hierarchies of authority, prestige, and influence, and disciplinary boundaries are challenged after that. But not only because of technology, because of wider reasons. And we're going to look at some of them here. So in the last 17 years, what we have in terms of social change, and of course, this is just a very limited picture of what is happening, but I try to find important things to give us that diachronic panoramic view. In 2008, we have the global financial crisis. 2013, I don't know more, and Black Lives Matter movement start to be known. 2015 is the Roads Must Fall movement that then help us popularize the idea of decolonization. In Canada, in this place we call Canada, we have the launch of the TRC report. TRC is Truth and Reconciliation Report. 2017, the Me Too movement, and that's the year where we have the world's richest 1% documented. This is documented that they own 50.1% of the world's wealth. 2019, there are school strikes for climate movement and the impact of Greta. 2020, the pandemic, and then the public awareness about unmarked graves in Canada of residential schools. 2022, Russia invades Ukraine and marks the end of post-Cold War stability in Europe. 2023, we have the Hamas attack on Israel that marks the intensification of regional and global tension. 2024, there's a horrific escalation of violence against Palestine, also in DRC, Sudan, Bangladesh, and the rise of global protest and polarization. It's also the hottest day ever recorded. And then 2025, Trump returns to power. There's a criminalization of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US and in other places, and a dismantling of liberal institutional powers. There's also backlash on reproductive rights and climate action, rising tariff wars, and annexation rhetoric, including the annexation of Canada, escalate global tensions. So in this meta consequence or polyculmination, there are calls for decolonization, reconciliation, racial justice, equity, end of gun violence, awareness of sexual violence, gender and sexual rights, mental health, climate action, and climate justice. At the same time that in higher education, there's reduced and targeted government investment, economic rationalization, which some people would say it's like the neoliberal project that is coming up already from the 1970s. There's a shift in student identity and perceived entitlements, and also a mental health crisis. So how does it, if we were to synthesize this, what's different in this? And Zygmunt Bauman talks about liquid modernity as the phase where solid modernity starts to destabilize and to become liquid. So I put here what are the 10 characteristics of liquid modernity that faculty members would be feeling in this period. So number one is the chaotic cacophony of perspectives. Both in terms of information and misinformation, the access to information and misinformation make it very difficult for meta-narratives and for consensus to be stable and enduring. Then there's also reactive polarization because there's a fragmentation of perspectives. Then you start to see echo chambers forming. There is also discursive transgression, causing policing and confusion. And this one is interesting because people realize that concepts are just agreements, they are conventions. And so discursive transgression is when people start to make these concepts more flexible, invent new words, but also then there's a backlash of people saying, you can't use this word, you have to speak in this way, and that causes more polarization. Number 4 is multiple moving layers of complexity. And here we need to remember that our formal schooling, it teaches us to see multiple layers, but then collapse the layers into one layer, impose a narrative of coherence, and then police the borders. And then that leads to a kind of pressure cooker situation, because when there's more complexity and you can't process it, there's a rise in anxiety, right? Because you want to police it even more. You want to keep the lid on, and then suddenly there is lentils everywhere. Then there is unprocessed hyperconsumption. We are consuming not just things, but we're consuming experiences, we're consuming relationships, we're consuming each other. And that creates a big constipation that requires probiotics and maybe even a controlled diarrhea so that we can pass it. Otherwise, our indigestions keep on bumping against each other. Number 6, a general lack of capacity to process contradictory emotions. And that's why I put the I put the bus at the beginning of this presentation, because if we don't have the language to talk about or to express ourselves in complex ways, about our own complexity, we tend to repress things, and then and we project, and then we see what we are repressing in other people, and that becomes a bit of a shit show in the relationship if we can't identify that. There's also excess of distractions and in tools, especially technological tools that promote dissociation. Then there are, of course, echo chambers and post-truth, people saying that using their narrative as representation of reality and truth, despite evidence of the contrary. So it doesn't matter anymore what the facts are. People create the narratives, and the narratives become reality for their echo chambers. And then wider intergenerational gaps. So there's a change in the intergenerational contract. So before, like in the liberal modernity project, since the end of the Second World War, you would have this intergenerational contract where young people would agree to pay for the pension of older people on the grounds that the older people would have left them a better world in this idea of progress and prosperity. And this was problematic in itself because it assumed that one specific ideology of progress and prosperity as consumption, right, would be sustainable in a finite planet, and it isn't. So it's not direct deception, but it's deception in terms of our calculations about our impact, our ecological impact, and also coming from our imposed sense of separation from the wider metabolism of the planet. And number 10, of course, stacked existential threats, war and cyber terrorism, climate destabilization, ecological collapse, and also the threat of unhinged AI, AI that might work against our interests, or AI that is weaponized in military and surveillance agendas. So how does it feel? Like there is for us watching all of this happen and us inside it. Some people have called it a clusterfuck. I think this is a very good word to describe it. But what we feel there is that there's this layers and layers of complexity on our back. So there's the weight of systemic, historical, intergenerational, and personal layers of complexity, and also complicity, because we are implicated in all of this of these processes. So then if you are carrying it on the back, you're kind of holding on to a stick of unstable certainties to try to get away from fear, frustration, resentment, hopelessness, disillusionment, immobilization, isolation, scarcity, and despair. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that this is also a result or a consequence of the kind of education that we received. And we need a different kind of education for ourselves and for our students that can help us do some weightlifting and take this blocks of weight from our back, place it in front of us, and then on the ground so that it can be collectively witnessed and processed. And now, if you're a weightlifter, you know that it's not for the faint of heart, but it's also, it has to be done in a specific way so that you don't get injured. So I think this metaphor is very apt for the kind of education that we need, that helps us do this movement without us injuring ourselves or each other in the process. Imagine if this weight falls into somebody else's foot. So back to the university. Remember that I talked about the university as an ivory tower, as a leaning tower, or as a nourish log. So if you're thinking about the university today as a leaning tower, how do we create the kinds of conditions where it becomes a nourish log? And part of this is this weightlifting, learning to weightlift from the back that is breaking, the weight that is breaking our back, putting it in front of us and then on the ground. But part of it is also moving from narrow boundary intelligence to wide boundary intelligence. And here this framework is actually coming from Nate Hagen's. And in narrow boundary, it's my interpretation of his framework, so it's a bit different too. It's inspired by from narrow boundary in narrow boundary intelligence, we have this way of seeing and being, which is focused on either or. So it's like single perspectives, and intelligence here means optimization for a single goal. So within modernity, the single goal has been progress and prosperity in a very specific way, social mobility, capital accumulation, etc. Now, wide boundary intelligence, instead of either or, is about both and more and moving. So we start to see the world as a very complex hologram, and we understand we can't see everything, but we engage with each other in a form of inquiry that is not about us, where intelligence is not about single goal optimization. We can see the layers and the layers of goals that we might have together collectively as a species. So moving, for example, from just capital accumulation, understanding that economic growth or growth-based economies in a climate, in a limited, finite planet, it doesn't go together. So holding that contradiction and then figuring out what to do with the interests of other species, other generations, of our own interests as we age in mind, requires a very different form of education that is not siloed and that is not about the single answer. It's about inviting people to hold together more and to stay in inquiry. And here you have the third one, which is the Mobius strip, representing relational entanglement or wisdom rather than intelligence. And this is about what wisdom traditions, including indigenous knowledges, bring to the table, where we understand that we are in constant co-constitutive movement. So thinking from that entanglement, thinking from the stance that you are part of the planet, you are part of other species as well. We are part of each other. I'm not just an individual that is isolated from the land or from different cultures. We are in ecology. So in that perspective, for example, I would be presenting myself to you as 33 trillion cells. I'm an ecosystem of 33 trillion cells, without mentioning the bacteria, which are 3 times this number of cells. So, and the bacteria are important because they keep me alive. So in this ecosystem, I'm not just the cells, I'm all the traumas and the hopes and the joys that my ancestors bring. I'm also coming in with imprints from the different cultures I've been exposed to, the different interactions. And I bring relational imprints and signatures from many different, from the trajectory that this ecosystem has thread, right? So it's a very different way of understanding ourselves in relationship and I'm not here even calling them systems in relationship to the metabolisms that we're all part of. So what I would say is needed today at a minimum is wide boundary intelligence with sprinkles of entanglement wisdom. And without that, our species is in a bit of a pickle because we're putting ourselves on a trajectory of agonizing extinction. Where we're going to turn on each other and fight for what's left. And in that context, uh, it's yeah, and we're bringing other species into extinction with us too. So it would be a very sad trajectory, but we also have, I think, a great opportunity now in the meta consequence and the polyculmination to do some reckoning and create a portal for a different form of existence. So this would be more or less what this presentation is about, but I wanted to finish with an example of a very, it's a very small example, but it's a story of what I had to do in trying to bring that sprinkle of wisdom into a process when I was a dean. So we were going through budget cuts in my faculty, and I think it was at the level of 7%, 4 to 7% that we had to be in that ballpark. And I knew that budget cuts are horrendous, right? So in that, because they had happened before, we knew that departments would be fighting with each other to try to keep the way whatever they could in the way they were. Like we tried to protect the past, basically. And my sense was that we needed to protect the future. And so I needed to create something that would help us see that. So what happened was that I asked for advice from a mentor, an indigenous mentor from Peru, Mama Maria. And she said, create a ritual. And she gave me some guidance on how to do that. And I was as a dean, I was very worried about how this was going to land or how this was going to be understood. So, but basically, in my first meeting with my leadership team, I put a bowl in the middle of the table, and we smudged as well. But there was the first request was to write down for each person at the table, all my heads of department, to write down the name of the children under 17 that they knew and they cared about. So they, and of course, all the children we know and we care about. So we put the names there and we announced the names as we put the names in the bowl. So everybody went around, put their names in the bowl. The second round was an invitation to write down the names of the groups of children who we felt were underserved by the system. So indigenous children, for example, queer children, trans children, children in hospitals, orphans, or children in zones of conflict, children with disability, like all kinds of children, children's groups were mentioned and also announced to the bowl, and we put it all in the bowl. And then the next round was to be thinking about what kinds of groups of children were not in the bowl already. So we're talking about all children. And then we identified the children who are not in the bowl, including the privileged children. And the last request was to put the last piece of paper that went on the bowl was both human and non-human children. And we covered the bowl with, as you see in the picture, red and white flowers. Everybody put some petals there. And then we invoked these children and we invoked the future. So we said, could these children be present in our decision-making process, but they would be older. They would be 30 years from now. So we said, can these children 30 years from now be present in our decision-making process so that our decisions are benefiting them, right? So that they say that these are good decisions to be made. And so we did this with the leadership group first, and then we did it with the whole faculty in a faculty retreat. And we invited a fish bowl to talk about this bowl where early career staff, faculty and staff in Canada, we have this distinction. Early career faculty staff were in the inner bowl, mid-career and senior staff and faculty were in the outer bowl. And the question then was, what needs to change at the university so that the early career people can fulfill their obligations to the bowl, to the future, right? And we also had an empty seat in the circle for ancestors, and then we invited senior faculty and staff. If they felt they needed to sit there, they would sit there and participate in the conversation. The only request was that they didn't represent themselves, that they would represent something else. So some of them represented the earth, for example, or the children themselves, or elders. And it was an incredible thing because generally this conversation would be about how can I have a successful academic career, but it became really how can the university serve its purpose in relationship to the future, to the children in the future, and what needs to change for that to happen. And I can say that our budget discussions were very different then because it shifts the sense of accountability, right, towards and gets us in a place where we understand that the trajectory and history of the university differently and know that we need to change to be able to fulfill these responsibilities. So I wanted to finish with that and then open up the circle for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Um, you've, I think, clinically depressed us all with the list of the state of the world, but many of us are acutely aware of that and are wanting to figure out ways of trying to make sense of this. And it's that sense-making process that you've been exploring. And that last example you just gave, I mean, how many faculties have done something like that? That's quite a transformational kind of practice to introduce, probably to great skepticism, I imagine, at the beginning anyway. This is not what we do, but yes, the power of indigenous practice and protocol. A nice example. Um, Hosai in the questions has just asked, could you say a bit more about the outcomes or emergence from that ritual? Is there more to say than you've shared about what flowed from that?
So it is in the second article. So the
Ah,
second article was written by the leadership team um, about the bowl and how it changed the ways that we structured. So what I can say is that the discussions would have been different about what needs to be protected and what needs to change. So some programs, for example, that you would feel that you have been teaching in them for 20 years and you wouldn't want to see them go. So at that point, there were openings for discussions about much more profound change that needed to happen if the goal is to serve rather than to protect. Rather than to protect the past, if the goal is to serve the future.
hmm, yes. Um,
Can go
uh,
back to the let me see if I can go back to the here. That's the
yep,
second article.
yeah. I posted that in the chat, folks. If someone's got the link quickly, then we can drop that in. Um, okay. Um, one one thing that's that I'm wrestling with, and which perhaps others are, if it sounds like we've got to break some quite bad news to our students.
Hmm.
And that's not an easy thing to do, to say something along the lines of, the future that you've been promised may not play out quite how it's been sold to you.
Hmm.
Um, is Have you been trying to develop ways of doing that in your universities? Do you have anything to share about how those conversations go? It's quite confronting stuff.
Yeah, it is confronting, and at the same time, which is interesting. Like I have an example from UBC, my previous university, where we wanted to create a course, and this was 2020 already. We wanted to create a course that would be bringing to the table questions of major systemic um, destabilization, right? And the way the university pushed back was to say, look, we already have a mental health crisis, a pandemic too. This will get the students to spiral. And what our response was this: it's true for some students, especially depending on the pedagogy that you use, they could spiral. But for some students, they are in the mental health crisis because we are not talking about it, right? So the difference here, let me see if I can spotlight for everyone. Like Simon, can you spotlight yourself and then we can be both here? Okay, here we are. Um, Yeah, I think part of the mental health crisis is that our courses are still promising things that the students themselves already know are not going to materialize. And then for some students, this knowing is helpful. For other students, this knowing might be too discombobulating. So, what we did in this course was to create a kind of a screening process where we had a questionnaire to see how much they were already leaning into, we already know this needs to be talked about, or I'm afraid of opening the Pandora box. And we worked then more with the students who are already leaning there, and we created a methodology or a pedagogy where the focus was on expanding our capacity to sit with complexity. And we talked to students about also expanding the nervous system. And one of the metaphors we have, like in my research collective, and we used in the course, was to talk about the shit. Like there's a lot of literal and metaphorical shit that needs to be composted, and we need the stomach to be able to face the shit and without throwing up on each other, without throwing a tantrum, and without throwing away. But what's interesting about this is that what we found in responses from colleagues, that they were not ready to do that. They would prefer not to face that. So we have an intergenerational problem there, where some students may be readier than the faculty themselves to open up or to face the shit and compost the shit. Whereas it is hard for the faculty. The other example that I have, which is interesting, was that, and this is more recent. So we had a crisis of accommodation. I'm sure every university must be going through something like that. So let's say before the pandemic, we would have 3,000 accommodations, accommodation requests a year. And an accommodation is for one exam. So 3,000 accommodations may mean that students were asking for 10 accommodations a year. So you can calculate the number of students there. After the pandemic, we have close to 30,000, right? So it was absolutely exponential, the growth of accommodations. But that's not like this is an event in itself. What I want to talk about is how faculty responded to that, and it was interesting. So we had to have conversations about how do we change examinations, because it's impossible to continue in the same way when we have this number of accommodations. And what I found interesting was that some faculty would come back and say, this is just temporary. When are we going back to normal? Right? And for some, and I was interested, I said, what do you think normal is and how and why? And for some people, normal was before the pandemic. Like, how do we go back to 3000? But for some people, normal was in the 90s. Like, there's a sense of nostalgia for when the university was perceived to be in its apex of I don't know, like in its highest point of self-importance or respect, societal respect, and there was this sense of nostalgia. And my job as a leader was also to say, okay, how do I prepare the faculty members that are nostalgic to understand that these numbers are only going to grow. They're not going to go back neither to the before pandemic, of course, not back to the 90s. And part of what we started to do to address that gap was exercises like the exercise of that we just did about technology. What has happened in technology and what has happened in society so that we can start talking about that and create this form of reasoning that can take account of a much wider temporality, but also all the layers that are happening. And then we can locate where the changes, not exactly, but how change happened and how there's no going back to what was before. And that helped a lot, I think. And these conversations needed to be intergenerational, right? So bringing in the voices of both early career and senior scholars and staff was extremely important. Also because they got mutually challenged in this, in terms of their aspirations or in terms of their understanding of the history of why we do certain things and how we do certain things. So it was an
Mm.
interesting experiment, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Just for information, folks, Vanessa's generously offered to stick around until quarter past the hour, so we have got time for some more conversation for those who can stick around. Okay, I'm just looking at the Q&A panel now. There's a question here from Monique, which is, well, how much energy we put into trying to maintain existing uni structures because we are where we are, right? This is also quite a relational kind of work. Monique is a colleague here at UTS. We are trying to protect our colleagues. There's a lot of emotional work going on, even as we try and figure out how do we get through very tight budgets. Um, uh, so, I mean, without making this specific to any university, many institutions are facing this transitional challenge, right? We have to
Mhm,
kind of keep the plane in the air, but we're
mhm.
trying to rebuild the plane as well, saying this plane is not going to get us through the coming storms. So I don't know. It's a big question, but what's front of mind as we wrestle with this challenge?
Yeah, this was very difficult there too, because we knew we needed to lose some positions. The most impactful conversations for me and very interesting were people then choosing to retire earlier for the purpose of like offering that line to be the one that is given up so that younger people, early career scholars
Hmm.
wouldn't be affected. So I felt that as a very gracious and kind of as a voluntary, but it is excruciatingly painful, I think, to think about the losses. Um, we managed to, when we had to return lines, to return only lines that were lines of people who had retired. So we didn't have to cut lines that were not like that, and I'm very grateful for that because it is a really painful process, and we understand how people want to protect
Hmm.
um, the lines of their colleagues. Yeah, and the line.
Yeah, yeah. Um, a question from Shabani is around the whole bus metaphor, which really resonated with her. Um, any further thoughts to share on how we we recognize our own flaws and try and create that gap. We have a reaction, but you're encouraging us to create space, a gap, that means we don't just react in our first reaction. We start listening to the other voices. You've done a lot of work with the bus. What's your suggestion for people who want to attend to the passengers in their bus? Where do they start doing this? How do they start doing this?
Yeah, the bus is not the only methodology available, right? There are others. IFS, Internal Family Systems, also does that, and others. Um, the work with the shadows is extremely important. And generally, like in my work, in my research collective, we say no shit, no starter. So if we don't start looking at ourselves as complex beings and everybody um, having rowdy passengers and trauma. And so until we can have compassion towards ourselves, even, right? We can't have compassion towards the other. And understanding that there are parts of ourselves we don't know, right? Understanding ourselves as also indeterminate, like we know parts of it and we are working, but we are also multiple inside, and we have the imprints that come from the way we've been raised, the background, the culture, um, and gifts and desires and dreams and ghosts and nightmares of these passengers, all part of the bus, plus the other decks of the bus, the ancestors, the whole humanity is in our bus, including also beyond humanity. Imagine a deck of your bus of other species. Now, the methodology of the bus, what I've found too, is that if it becomes a practice, right? So if in a meeting you can say, there's a passenger on my bus that is saying this, also people don't see that you are not, when you say there's a passenger, it's just a part of you who's saying it, and you don't lose face in saying, and then you can say there's a conversation in my bus where one passenger is saying there's another passenger saying that, including the conversation, like for example about the faculty members who said, I'm going to retire a little bit early so that we can help the faculty with this. There were passengers on my bus saying, okay, like how do we honor both the fact that we need renewal, but we also need mentors, and we need people to remain connected to the community, right?
Yeah.
In this intergenerational, how do we achieve this intergenerational balance where everybody's here focused on the goal? There was also parts about like some people remain in the role sometimes because it's a survival thing. It's not necessarily because they're super involved in the community, but because they need the funds, because they may have a health issue, for example, that they need to remain in the job. So it's very complicated to create a process where everybody feels they belong to something bigger than themselves and want to work together towards that goal. But the bus has been a very important thing to prevent reactions and prevent unnecessary conflict. Is important, but unnecessary. There are types of conflict that break the fabric and the motivation of people to want to be together, and that's what we wanted to avoid. We wanted to bring friction, as you say, Simon, because friction is important, but not friction, not the kind of fracture. Maybe there's a difference between friction and fracture in
Hmm.
that sense in creating community.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. Rohan is asking if the neurodiversity smorgasbord from Sunny Jane Wise is something that you have incorporated at all.
No, we incorporated neurodivergency, but not the smorgasbord. I would love to see the smorgasbord by
Okay.
Sonny Jane Wise. I will have a look into that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Now we got a question from Lynn who is asking about the nurse log metaphor, which is the subject of the first paper, the one we've currently got linked on the event page. You know, what does this mean in terms of how it would nourish environments? Can you give us an example? Is there an example yet of a university that was perhaps a leaning tower of Pisa, but then has figured out what it means to collapse, at least partially, and turn more into a nursing log, which is the nurse log, which is a powerful metaphor.
Thank you. The example that I have, and it's in the paper, we have two examples in the paper, right? But one of them was I was invited to hospice, a Institute for Advanced Studies. So Institute for Advanced Studies in research universities are very elitist places where like a lot of money is put into like 10 faculty members a year that are handpicked from the university and given much more resources to sometimes jumpstart their career, but sometimes it's for senior researchers to have more substantial assets to continue their excellence, things like that. So this institute was going to close anyway, and I was invited to be the last director. And that was an interesting process to be the last because some faculty members in the university didn't want it to close, so you have to kind of be in a very difficult position. But I was in a situation where the process of closure took longer than was expected. And in the last year, I had the opportunity to have the budget, but do what I thought was like with my academic freedom, decide how to spend the money. And instead of doing this elitist program, what I decided to do was to do an indigenous focus program based on the climate and nature emergency and spread these resources across the board. Like we had a cohort of undergrad students, a cohort of grad students, a cohort of staff who are not faculty members in Canada, a cohort of faculty members, and a cohort of emeriti working together. So instead of allocating this money for 10 to 12 people, we allocated it across 60 people. And and also redistributed some of this funding in reparations and redistribution because that's what we prioritized in research. And we tried to do like in a year everything that would be associated with this nurse log and distribution of resources and losing the elitism and changing the power relations and bringing generations together. So there is a report. There's a summary of that in the article. But if you go online, I think you can still find it. The report is called "Moving with Storms," and there's a lot there that of the good things that happened and also the challenges that we found in trying to shift the university in that way. Because for some people that was very confronting, right? Like imagine you're expecting this super high status institute suddenly to be doing work that is considered to be of low, like not even low status, like it was something unimaginable that would be happening. So that
Mm.
would be one.
Yeah, that's a nice example, and it makes me wonder whether, that was possible because this institute was about to close, which, it makes you wonder, do people have to be basically facing a crisis or even death, metaphorically, in the organization before they're ready to try some of this new stuff? It seems a little depressing that we have to get to that point. But
Agree.
maybe that's one of the insights that here with colleagues I've been thinking about how do we end things well?
Mhm.
The Moving with Storms project is one example of ending things well. Um, but it seems a shame that things have got to be, basically facing their end before they may be open to trying something like that.
What is interesting too, I think, is that when I had the budget in my hands of how I could have gone and done the same thing if I wanted to please my colleagues. I would have done exactly the same as what the Institute had done, right? So
Yeah.
it will require, it is a deathbed conversation, but it also requires somebody to say, that's the time to experiment, right? I'm not going to, at the
Mm,
deathbed, we're not going to do the same thing. We're going to try something different and face the consequence. I like there was pushback for sure, and
mm,
not of the kind the kind one. But I think seeing the arc of it, I had colleagues saying to me that when emeritus colleagues saying we would have gone down on the limb, and then we actually went down with a bang, and it will be remembered for that as an example at the university of what could be done. So I was
mm,
happy about that, but also in the beginning I had to measure, right, to calculate like what am I going to lose and what are the possibilities here of gain if I do this? And it was not it was an easy choice in my heart for many of my passengers, but some passengers were concerned about like, because you pushback requires a lot of emotional labor
mm,
and it affects your nervous system too, right? Unless you have, you are thick-skinned, and thick-skinned is not what I am. I tend to absorb whatever is thrown at me and try to metabolize. And that has a cost to my health. And
mm. Yeah, yeah. And we do appreciate that. Um, so look, there's one. Let me just give you one final question here from Cameron, who's saying, look, Vanessa, your work is integrative. It's helping us bridge different disciplinary worlds. It feels like it is more reform than revolution in its appeal to regeneration and composting. You know, composting doesn't happen overnight, does it? Does this help you work within a system like higher ed, helping you map connections across established scholarly disciplinary work as we sit with the complexity? So there's a few things in that. How do you want to pick up that?
it's interesting. So in my work, we talk about reform and beyond reform. So reform would be replace something so that the system continues. Or replace it with an already known system. Beyond reform, we say this is not gonna like this is gonna fall and go to the ground. So we do the a containment thing so that it falls in a better way. It's hospicing work. So I wouldn't put myself in like reform. Uh, yeah, I think we use different classifications because the revolution then is that I already know how it would be and I will try to impose it. And that you cannot do that without coercion, basically. And because it's going to be very difficult to get everybody on board. So you have to use power to impose. The way that we've been doing it in my research and in the collective is to find the timing where the system is already in the deathbed, and then and help people sit with that complexity, and then invite a different form of palliative care, basically, but where we don't put the system on life support. That's not the life support is not the idea.
Mm,
The idea is palliative care for a good death, because like if we're going back to the Tower of Pisa, the Tower of Pisa metaphor, there are people like my colleagues of mine who say, let's just bring it down because it has been elitist, colonial, white supremacist, whatever, and we don't want it anymore. And I mean, that's a perspective, and like, good luck, also. But there is also the perspective that a dignified death that is relational, that brings people along into the complexity of facing our own mortality, both as people, as a species, as a planet, and as institutions, creates other possibilities that we cannot imagine from the outset. And then the navigating that creates a different relational fabric than just trying to replace with a specific agenda. But this methodology doesn't negate the different agendas. So we try to create a fabric that allows people to have very different understandings and opinions. But at points, like what happened with the institute, you have to make a decision. Um, who can I afford to upset? Basically, is has been the question.
Thank you, thank you. It's a great note to end. You know, it's we're back to hospicing modernity, really. This dying well, dying a good death, coming to terms with what the dark side of has been, but recognizing all the good that has been done. And this notion of, well, what is waiting to be born? What is being conceived? And what do we now need to midwife through to birth, even though we don't know exactly what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
I think this is a powerful metaphor, a beautiful stance. So look, thank you. We need to let you go now. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. The comments show how much people have been appreciating this. Uh, let's say thanks to Vanessa in the chat. Thanks everyone for joining and go well. Thank you very much.
You.